The anchor was still in the boat. Both life jackets were still in the boat. And Brian Hooker was drifting away from his wife for 9 hours. That is where this story breaks open. Not in the courtroom, not in a press conference. Right there, in the space between what a person does when someone they love falls into the water and what Brian Hooker says he did. Because those two things are not the same. They are not even close to the same. And every sailor, every diver, every person who has ever been on the water in their life knows it the moment they hear it. This is the Crime Files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Lynette Hooker was last seen alive on April 4th. She was in the Bahamas with her husband Brian on their 46-foot sailboat, a sloop named Soulmate. They had spent the afternoon at Tahiti Beach. They had drinks. Later, they moved to the Abaco Inn, a bar on the island where Brian says they each had 2 rum and cokes over roughly 3 hours. Around 7:30 in the evening, they got into their dinghy, a small, rigid 8-foot plastic tender, to make the trip back to Soulmate, which was anchored out in Aunt Pat's Bay, approximately 1,000 yards away. They went into the water together. Only Brian came back. What he says happened next is the story this investigation is built on examining. And the examination does not go well for his account. Brian Hooker told investigators and rescue workers that somewhere in White Sound Channel, approximately 150 yards from shore, Lynette bounced out of the dinghy. He says the waves were rough, 2 to 4 feet. He says the wind was strong and the currents were powerful. He says one of his oar pins broke and he lost a paddle. He says he tried to reach her with the remaining oar but could not make headway. He says he threw a floating cushion toward her. Not a life jacket. A cushion, even though there were 2 life jackets in the boat. He says he could not reach her. And then, and this is the part that stops every experienced mariner cold, he says he drifted away from her, away from the anchored boats around him, away from the shore lined with houses just 150 yards away. He drifted for 9 hours and ended up 4 miles away in Marsh Harbor. The anchor was in the dinghy. He did not drop it. Let us now take Brian Hooker's account and place it against what the evidence actually shows, piece by piece. Because that is where the story reveals itself. The weather that night. Brian described conditions so dangerous that he could not control a small boat or paddle toward his wife. Multiple people who were physically present in Aunt Pat's Bay on the evening of April 4th have described the conditions as calm. Not mildly rough, calm. The bay sits in the lee of Elbow Key, meaning the island itself blocks wind and swell from the open Atlantic. That is why sailors anchor there. Official meteorological data for the area that evening does not support 2 to 4 foot seas in that location. The people who were there say the water was close to flat. The depth of the water. At 150 yards from shore in White Sound Channel, the water in that area is shallow. The bone fishing flats adjacent to the channel are ankle deep in places. People with direct knowledge of those waters, local fishermen, guides, sailors who have navigated that channel for years have consistently described it as a zone where an adult can stand in many spots. Lynette Hooker fell into shallow water near shore in a calm anchorage. The question of why she did not stand up has never been answered within Brian's account. The question of why Brian did not get out of the dinghy and wade toward her has never been answered either. The oar. Brian says a pin broke and he lost one paddle, leaving him unable to row effectively. This specific claim was tested in the real world. A man named Blaine Stevenson, a friend of Lynette's who has been following this case closely, took a comparable dinghy onto the water on a day with sustained winds between 15 and 22 knots. That is a 20-knot wind environment, equal to or greater than what Brian described. Blaine used a single paddle. He paddled that dinghy back to his anchored sailboat in under 2 minutes. One paddle, 20-knot wind, under 2 minutes. While he was doing it, 3 separate boats from the surrounding anchorage moved toward him to offer help. Because that is what sailors do. When someone is struggling in a dinghy, you go to them. You do not look away. Brian Hooker was 150 yards from shore, surrounded by anchored boats in full daylight. Sunset at that latitude in early April is around 8 p.m. And not one person came to help. Not one person saw Lynette in the water. Not one witness to a catastrophic emergency that allegedly unfolded in the middle of a populated anchorage on a calm, still bright evening. The clothing description. When rescuers found Brian the following morning and began planning their search for Lynette, they needed to know what she looked like in the water. He told them she was wearing a black bathing suit. Photographs taken earlier that same day show Lynette in an aqua-colored bathing suit cover-up and a bright blue scarf on her head. These are not subtle differences. In open water, from a search helicopter or a rescue boat, the difference between looking for black and looking for aqua and bright blue is enormous. Brian Hooker did not mention the cover-up. He did not mention the scarf. He sent rescuers looking for the wrong colors. The flare. This is one of the most significant pieces of testimony in the entire case. At approximately 8 in the evening, roughly 15 to 20 minutes after the moment when, by Brian's account, Lynette fell into the water and he began drifting away, a group of people anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay saw a flare. They were together, multiple people, and they corroborate each other's account. They described the flare as going up from the direction of Soulmate, not from a dinghy drifting in the channel, not from Brian's eventual position at the northern end of Lubber's quarters, where he later claims he fired a flare after 9 hours of drifting, from Soulmate, the anchored boat. The boat that, according to Brian, was empty and unmanned at 8 p.m. because both he and Lynette were nowhere near it. A flare requires a person to fire it. An empty boat does not produce flares. Brian's own account of firing a flare places the event hours later and miles away. So, the flare that multiple witnesses saw at 8 p.m. near Soulmate, that flare exists outside his account entirely. It has no explanation within the story he told. The tides. Brian presented himself to investigators as someone unfamiliar with the tidal patterns in that area. He claimed not to really know the tides around Elbow Key, but a phone conversation that was obtained and reviewed by people close to this investigation tells a different story. In that conversation, Brian referenced flood tides, ebb tides, and tidal behavior around midnight, using the specific vocabulary and timing knowledge of someone who has studied those waters carefully. You do not accidentally know flood and ebb cycles at midnight. That is not confused speech. That is expertise. And the tides he claimed would have carried him away from Elbow Key and toward Marsh Harbor. Those tides, according to people with professional knowledge of the area, were not present in that location on that night in that form. The watch. When Brian Hooker was released from Bahamian custody after 5 days of detention, he walked out wearing his smartwatch. This was not a simple clock. It was a modern device that logs GPS position, movement data, activity records, and heart rate continuously. For an investigation in which the central question is what Brian Hooker was physically doing between 7:30 p.m. and 4 a.m., where he was, whether he was moving or stationary, what his physiological state was, that watch is not jewelry. It is a timeline recorded on his wrist. It was given back to him. He left the Bahamas with it. Shortly after his release, Brian Hooker departed the country. He has not publicly indicated any intention to return. No charges have been filed. Now let us talk about what the investigation has uncovered that Brian's account cannot account for. Starting with a boat called Azura. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, a federal law enforcement body, not the Rescue Division, has entered this case. They released a photograph of a vessel anchored near Soulmate on the night of April 4th and asked the public for help identifying it. The image was low quality. Independent researchers working with the sailing community enhanced the photograph and identified the boat. Its name is Azura. It was anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay that night, directly adjacent to Soulmate. On the night of April 4th, Azura was not broadcasting AIS, the automatic identification system that most larger boats use to make themselves trackable. This means Azura was invisible to official maritime tracking systems that night, but it was there. People in the anchorage confirm it. The Coast Guard wants to talk to the people aboard Azura. That is not a casual request. Federal investigators do not make public outreach campaigns about vessels they consider irrelevant. The crew of Azura was anchored next to Soulmate. They may have seen someone on deck after 7:45. They may have heard voices or movement. They may have security cameras that captured something in the background. They may have seen the flare. They may have noticed the lights on Soulmate going on or off during hours when, by Brian's account, no one was aboard. They may know everything or nothing, but the investigators working this case believe they are worth finding. The Abaco Inn is holding another piece of this puzzle. The bar and restaurant where Brian and Lynette spent the early evening has surveillance video from April 4th. That video has not been publicly released. Bahamian police have instructed the establishment not to release it. The content of that video, what time the couple arrived, what time they left, what their demeanor was, whether they appeared to be in conflict, remains inside the investigation. The reason for withholding it from the public has not been explained officially. In an active investigation, that explanation may be entirely legitimate, but its absence from the public record means a key piece of contextual evidence that could either support or contradict Brian's timeline has not been independently verified. Soulmate itself is a source of potential forensic evidence that has not been fully addressed publicly. A 46-foot sloop has significant interior surface area. A cabin, a galley, sleeping quarters, a head, a cockpit. If anything happened aboard that boat, forensic examination could detect it. Blood that has been cleaned away leaves cellular material behind. Cleaning agents used to remove biological evidence leave chemical signatures, touch DNA from surfaces, fingerprints in places that would only be accessed under specific circumstances. The boat's own electronics, GPS chart plotter logs, AIS position history, VHF radio call records could show whether Soulmate moved during the night, whether any transmissions were made, whether the boat's systems were accessed after 7:30 p.m. Whether all of this has been examined to a thorough forensic standard has not been confirmed publicly. Lynette's phone and Brian's phone are another dimension of this investigation. Phone records show call history, text history, tower connections, and data usage. They can be used to triangulate approximate position at specific times. Lynette's last confirmed contact with her family was a phone call to her mother, Darlene, in which she described their afternoon at Tahiti Beach. That call has a timestamp and a tower connection. After that call, Lynette's phone either continued generating records, connecting to towers, showing data usage, or it went silent. When did it go silent? Where was it connecting when it did? Brian's phone records carry equivalent weight. If his phone was pinging towers near Elbow Key at 8 p.m., at the same time witnesses placed the flare near Soulmate, that is a geographic confirmation that his account of drifting away from the boat by that time cannot accommodate. Now let us examine the two frameworks through which this case is being analyzed, and do so honestly. The first framework is accident. Something genuinely went wrong. Lynette fell. Brian panicked. The decisions he made in the following hours, not throwing the life jacket, not dropping the anchor, not signaling for help, drifting for 9 hours, were the product of shock, disorientation, and possibly impairment. The incomplete clothing description was confused memory under trauma. The weather description was exaggerated by a frightened man. The flare witnesses were mistaken about the source. The tidal knowledge was coincidental. Under this framework, Brian Hooker is a man who failed catastrophically to save his wife, and has been living with that failure since April 4th. The problems with this framework are substantial. The weather data does not support his description. The water depth does not explain why neither of them attempted to stand or wade. The practical dinghy demonstration shows the return trip was achievable in under 2 minutes in comparable conditions. No witness in the populated anchorage saw the emergency he describes. The flare appeared in a location his account cannot explain. The drift direction he describes does not match the wind data. The clothing description he gave searchers did not match the photographs taken that day. And a man with Marine Corps training in shallow water 150 yards from shore does not drift away from his wife for 9 hours without attempting any of the obvious physical options available to him. The second framework is that this was not an accident, that something happened, aboard Soulmate, or in a sequence of events that ended there, and that the account of Lynette falling overboard in the channel was constructed to explain her absence in a way that is difficult to forensically disprove without a body and without direct witnesses. Under this framework, the flare at 8 Bas near Soulmate indicates someone was aboard the boat during the period Brian claims to have been drifting away from it. The incomplete clothing description was deliberate, not confused. The 9-hour drift story creates a block of unverifiable time functioning as an alibi. The tidal knowledge Brian denied having was real knowledge he chose to conceal because it would undermine his claim of being swept away helplessly. The departure from the Bahamas after 5 days of detention was not the behavior of a man committed to helping find his wife. The evidence supports parts of both frameworks, but when you place them side by side and weigh the documented evidence against each one, the number of facts that are unexplained within the accident framework significantly exceeds the number of facts unexplained within the alternative. That is not a verdict. It is an observation about where the weight of available evidence currently points. Where this case stands today is a picture of unfinished work and open questions. Lynette Hooker's body has not been recovered. Brian Hooker is no longer in the Bahamas. No charges have been filed. The CGIS investigation is active. The owners of Azura have not been publicly located. The Abaco Inn video has not been released. The smartwatch data is not in investigative custody as far as public records indicate. The flare reported at 8:12 p.m. by multiple witnesses near Soulmate has not been officially explained. The bone fishing flats that Brian said carried dangerous currents are still as shallow and calm as they have always been. Lynette's mother, Darlene, had a phone call with her daughter on the afternoon of April 4th. Lynette told her about the beach, the drinks, the day. She was alive and talking and describing the ordinary texture of a vacation afternoon. That conversation is the last record anyone has of Lynette Hooker speaking. After that, there is only Brian's account and the evidence that does not fit inside it. The maritime community has a responsibility here that goes beyond reading about this case online. If you were in Aunt Pat's Bay or anywhere near Elbow Key during Easter weekend, you may have footage you have not yet thought to examine. A sunset video with something happening in the background, motion-activated security footage from your boat's stern camera. A photo taken at the anchorage with Soulmate visible in the frame at a time that matters. The most important image in this investigation may already exist on someone's phone or hard drive. The person who has it may not know what they are holding. That is the nature of background evidence. It only reveals itself when you know what to look for. If you know the crew of Azura, they need to understand that investigators want to speak with them, not as suspects, as potential witnesses who were in the right place at the right time and who may have information that no one else in this case can provide. Getting that message to them through the sailing community, through anchorage networks, cruising forums, VHF word of mouth, the coconut telegraph that connects sailors across the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard may be the fastest path to finding them. And if you know anything about this case, anything at all, any detail that seemed minor at the time, it may not be minor in context. Context is everything. A sound at the wrong hour, a light that should not have been on, a dinghy moving in a direction that did not quite make sense, a conversation overheard at a dock. These things matter in ways that only become clear when someone who knows the full picture of the investigation hears them. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, a mother waiting for answers, and a case that still has evidence waiting to be found, people waiting to come forward, and truth that has not yet been fully spoken. The search for truth continues. There is a dimension of this case that has not received enough direct attention, and it lives in the specific behavior patterns of the hours before and after Lynette's disappearance. Behavior tells a story, not the kind of story that convicts anyone in a court, but the kind of story that experienced investigators read like a map. And the behavioral map in this case has landmarks that keep pointing in the same direction. Consider the sequence of events on the morning of April 5th. Brian Hooker was found after his 9-hour drift. He was brought to shore. He was met by fire and rescue personnel who were mobilizing a search for his wife. In those first critical minutes, when a man who has just lost his wife to the ocean is speaking to the people who are about to go look for her, the behavioral baseline is well established from thousands of similar cases. Desperation, urgency, the kind of frantic, detailed recall that comes from a mind replaying the same traumatic images over and over. The compulsive need to tell rescuers everything, every detail of what she was wearing, where she went in, what she looked like in the water, which direction she was moving, anything that could help find her faster. Brian Hooker told them she was wearing a black bathing suit, and then, when asked directly about what he was experiencing emotionally, he described himself as confused. After 2 Cuba Libres over 3 hours in the middle of a full afternoon and evening, confused, on a clear morning, about where his wife had been in the water the night before. Confused in a way that led him to describe her clothing incorrectly and omit the aqua cover-up and bright blue headscarf that she was visibly wearing in photographs taken hours earlier. The people who were out there searching the water that morning were looking for a woman in a black bathing suit. For however many hours that incorrect description guided the search parameters, those are hours that cannot be recovered, and Brian Hooker was the only person who could have given the correct description and chose not to. There is also the matter of how Brian described the physical mechanics of losing Lynette. He has said at various points that she bounced out, that the waves hit the dinghy and she went over the side. This is a specific physical claim about how a person exits a small boat. In the sailing community, this description has been examined against the known characteristics of a rigid 8-foot plastic dinghy in the water conditions he described, or rather, in the actual conditions that witnesses and weather data confirm were present that night. A rigid plastic dinghy in flat to mildly rippled water in a sheltered anchorage does not produce the kind of violent movement that would eject a seated adult passenger without warning. These boats are stable platforms precisely because of their construction. They are not inflatable pool toys that flip in a breeze. An adult seated in an 8-foot rigid dinghy in calm water in a protected bay does not bounce out unless something very unusual happens. What would cause a person to go over the side of a dinghy in calm conditions? A standing position that became unstable, a sudden lurch forward caused by a collision or a very sharp wave, a physical interaction with another person in the boat. These are the categories of explanation that fit the physics. The passive, unpredictable, weather-caused ejection that Brian describes does not fit the documented conditions. Then there is the 9-hour gap itself. 9 hours. From approximately 7:45 p.m. to somewhere around 4:00 or 5:00 a.m. the following morning, Brian Hooker was, by his account, adrift in a small dinghy in the Sea of Abaco. 9 hours of drifting. In a boat that, when recovered the following day, was described by fire and rescue workers as so light it almost seemed like it could be blown off the water by wind gusts. A boat that light, in the conditions that night, would have moved. It would have covered distance. The question is whether it would have covered the specific distance in the specific direction that Brian claims. Wind direction determines drift direction for a small, lightweight boat with no motor. The documented wind conditions for the Abaco area on the night of April 4th have been examined by people with meteorological and maritime expertise. The direction Brian would have needed to drift in order to end up at Marsh Harbor after 9 hours, coming from the exit of White Sound Channel near Elbow Key, requires a wind pattern that does not fully match the recorded data. The more consistent drift path for a boat of that description, given the actual wind conditions, would have moved it toward Lubber's Quarters rather than toward Marsh Harbor. This is not a subtle error. This is a directional discrepancy that points toward a question investigators cannot ignore. If the boat was not drifting for 9 hours, what was it doing? And where was Brian Hooker during those 9 hours? The answer to that question may be in the phone records. It may be in the smartwatch data. It may be in the security footage that boats in that anchorage recorded through the night. It may be in the memory of someone who was up late on Easter weekend, watching the water from a cockpit, and saw something that did not make sense to them at the time. The Bahamas is a collection of islands spread across thousands of square miles of ocean, with a tourism economy, a limited investigative infrastructure, and a legal system that operates under resource constraints that American investigators do not face. This context matters, not because it excuses anything, but because it explains some of the procedural frustrations that people following this case have observed, things that would be standard evidence preservation steps in a major American metropolitan investigation. Securing a suspect's digital devices before release, obtaining and preserving surveillance video immediately, conducting a full forensic sweep of the primary scene before it can be accessed or contaminated. These steps require resources, coordination, and institutional will that do not always align in practice. The involvement of the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service changes the investigative dynamic, at least partially. The CGIS has federal resources, forensic capabilities, and a specific mandate to investigate maritime incidents involving American citizens. Their ability to compel cooperation within Bahamian jurisdiction is legally limited, but their ability to investigate on the American end, phone records, financial records, digital forensics involving devices and accounts connected to American systems and carriers, is not similarly constrained. If Brian Hooker's phone is connected to an American carrier, those records are potentially accessible through American legal process. If the smartwatch uploads data to a cloud server operated by an American company, which most modern smartwatches do, then the data that was on Brian's wrist when he walked out of Bahamian custody may still exist in a server somewhere accessible to federal investigators with the right legal instruments. Data deleted from a device often persists in cloud backups longer than people realize. The 9-hour gap may have a digital record. That record may still be retrievable. Financial records are another avenue that federal investigators can pursue with American process. Did Brian Hooker have life insurance on Lynette? Were there recent changes to beneficiary designations, bank accounts, or financial instruments in the months before April 4th? These are standard investigative questions in any case involving the unexplained disappearance of a spouse. The answers are either consistent with nothing unusual or they are not. Either way, they belong in the evidentiary picture. The people who knew Lynette Hooker personally, her friends, her family members beyond her mother Darlene, people who had conversations with her in the weeks and months before April 4th, carry testimony about her state of mind, her relationship with Brian, and whether she expressed any concerns or fears that feel different now in retrospect. People often say things to close friends that they do not say to investigators. They describe relationship dynamics in private that they would characterize more carefully in formal settings. The informal testimony that has circulated among people following this case through friends of Lynette suggests a relationship with a history that is relevant context. Without the ability to independently verify the specifics of those accounts, the responsible position is simply to say, that testimony exists, it is being discussed, and a thorough investigation takes it seriously. What Lynette Hooker's disappearance ultimately asks of everyone who hears this story is a willingness to sit with uncomfortable questions and not look away from them. The questions are not comfortable. They require considering that a man may have harmed his wife and then constructed a story designed to prevent that harm from being proven. They require accepting that official investigators in a foreign jurisdiction may not have handled a serious case with the thoroughness it deserved. They require believing that the sailing community, the maritime public, and ordinary citizens paying attention can actually make a difference to whether this case is solved or quietly filed away. Those are the stakes. A woman is gone. Her family has no answers. The man who was with her when she disappeared has left the country. The evidence that exists, documented, verified, consistent across multiple independent sources, does not support his account. The investigation is open. The witnesses are still out there. the footage may still exist. Lynette Hooker was a real person. She had a mother who loved her. She had an afternoon at the beach and drinks at a bar and a phone call home on what turned out to be the last day of her life. She deserved better than what happened to her on April 4th. And she deserves better than a case that is allowed to go cold before the truth is found. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a case that may still have answers waiting to be found. The search for truth continues.